The senator from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to support a number of our nominees for ambassadors and positions within the State Department. As the chair of the European Affairs Subcommittee, I am particularly concerned about the number of openings we have in Europe for ambassadorial for ambassadors. So I want to support today Mark Gittenstein, again, to be U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Kent Logsdon to be U.S. Ambassador to Moldova, Michael Murphy to be U.S. Ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina, Claire Cronin to be U.S. Ambassador to Ireland, Denise Bauer to be U.S. Ambassador to France and Monaco, and Julissa Reynoso to be Ambassador to Spain and Andorra. So those are the ambassadors in Europe that I wanted to raise this afternoon, but I also want to raise concern about Rufus Gifford, who has been nominated to be Chief of Protocol for the Department of State. As I said, I'm chair of the European Subcommittee, and so I've had the opportunity to attend the hearings for these nominees and to see just how qualified they are and how important to American foreign policy they are. Earlier this week, Victoria Nuland, who is an undersecretary at the Department of State, testified in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the United States foreign diplomacy is operating at quarter power as a consequence of the numerous holds that have been placed on ambassadorial appointments by just a few of our Republican colleagues. I have some maps here that I think really very vividly demonstrate the consequences of this inaction in the Senate. The first, you want to give me the first map first? The first map shows where we have U.S. ambassadors to Europe. So you can see anything blue is where we have ambassadors. So on this map, everything from Spain to Ukraine, the United Kingdom, Iceland, Ireland, we have no U.S. ambassadors approved in those countries. And compare that to what Russia and China have in terms of their diplomatic ability in Europe. This gold color are Russian ambassadors, countries where Russia has their ambassadors, virtually every country in Europe. Red is where China has its ambassadors, virtually every country in Europe. And again, in the United States, our ambassadors in Europe, it's basically empty. Finland, Sweden, Norway, Spain, France, Germany, Poland, Ireland, the EU. We are desperately in need of ambassadors because right now we have very little presence in Europe. And this is happening at a time when we know there are significant challenges taking place in Europe, particularly in Ukraine, where Russia is threatening to invade Ukraine, its sovereign territory, again, and where we need, if we're going to be successful in responding to Russia, where we need to take a unified approach among our allies. We need to be working with the EU, with NATO, with all of our European allies, and yet in most of the countries where we need to be working, we don't have ambassadors. And we don't have ambassadors because of opposition from just a few of our Republican colleagues. And I see Senator Cruz on the floor, so I know that he's going to be here to object to my effort to move these. But this is the impact of what's happening as the result of your holds, Senator Cruz. We can't put our national security in the hands of those people who don't have the status of ambassadors. We know that our embassies are doing a great job in all of those countries. They're working hard, but it makes a difference to have someone who's been approved by the Senate, who's been nominated by the President, who has the rank of ambassador. And, you know, as I think about the challenges that are facing this country, I can't think of anything that is more harmful to our foreign policy than deliberately hampering this country's ability to advance American interests on the international stage. I want to say a few words about each of these nominees before I move for unanimous consent. And again, I'd like to begin with Mark Gittenstein, who's already served our nation before. He was the U.S. ambassador to Romania. He has spent over 25 years working on energy issues, and as we think about the negotiations that are happening around energy and Nord Stream 2 in particular, which I know is a concern for Senator Cruz because it's a concern that I have, we don't have an ambassador to the EU at the table for those discussions. And Mr. Gittenstein's nomination is critically important in responding to Russia's weaponization of gas flows to Europe and strengthening the transatlantic alliance as we face escalating aggression from Russia. And similarly, Kent Logston's nomination as ambassador to Moldova couldn't come at a more critical moment where Russia is again using energy there as a weapon. Maya Sandu, the newly elected pro-EU, pro-reform president there, has every intention of steering Moldova, the poorest country in Europe, toward a better path, and she's looking west to do that. But of course, she's already faced pressure from Putin and his cronies who have threatened to weaponize gas flows into Moldova. We can't allow Moldova to become the next Ukraine or the next Georgia, and we can only prevent that by conveying strong U.S. leadership to support its pro-European aspirations. I also want to say a few words on Michael Murphy's nomination as ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina. America played a critical role in bringing peace to Bosnia through the Dayton Accords. But we're seeing now that peace and stability in Bosnia, unity in Bosnia are under increasing attack. Earlier today, I had, had a chance to meet with the Bosnian foreign minister, and I am seriously concerned by the deteriorating political situation there. It requires an expert career diplomat like Michael Murphy to provide the commanding leadership to help Bosnia through this moment. The same is true in Ireland. My allergies are getting the best of me today. Cronin's nomination as ambassador to Ireland is not just a symbolic gesture to a long-standing ally of the United States. Peace in Northern Ireland is hanging by a thread as the UK, Ireland, and the EU handle the fallout from Brexit. I was concerned by the release of a report on Tuesday which indicated that the paramilitary gangs embedded in Northern Ireland's divided communities pose, and I quote, a clear and present danger of violence fueled by post-Brexit tensions. By stalling our confirmation of Ms. Cronin, we risk tarnishing our legacy in fostering peace in Northern Ireland through the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, Denise Bauer's nomination to France is necessary as the country prepares for national elections next year. These elections have significant implications for our bilateral relationship, in addition to the role that France will play in the EU and NATO. Similarly, Julissa Reynoso's nomination to Spain requires swift confirmation. Spain will host the Madrid summit next year, where NATO will elect the next Secretary General and finalize the strategic concept. What happens in NATO is critical to America's national security, and we want to have an ambassador on the ground there who can monitor what's going on with those talks, in addition to the other officials we need to send. Finally, Ambassador Rufus Gifford has been nominated to be the Chief of Protocol for the Department of State. He previously served as our ambassador to Denmark, where the Queen there acknowledged him for his meritorious service to the Kingdom of Denmark. His background and service will make him an excellent Chief of Protocol, and we urgently need him in place to assist Secretary Blinken. Combined, these nominations are all critical to immediate challenges facing our national security interests. So with that in mind, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding Rule 22, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations. Executive calendars number 320, 440, 447, 448, 450, 454, and 519, that the Senate vote on the nominations en bloc without intervening action or debate, that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that any statements related to the nominations be printed in the record, and that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action and the Senate resume legislative session.
Is there an objection? Mr. President. The senator from Texas.
Reserving the right to object. You know, in Washington, there's always political rhetoric that goes around. The senator from New Hampshire just moments ago described the embassies in Europe that are missing ambassadors, and she said they're missing ambassadors because of Republican objections, and she highlighted in particular Ukraine. Mr. President, I'd like to point out there's some irony in her doing so, because actually the reason there is no ambassador in Ukraine is because of one thing and one thing only. President Biden has not nominated anybody to serve as ambassador to Ukraine. We're in December of the first year of his presidency, and Biden has yet to name an ambassador. And so there are no Republican holds, there are no Republican objections to an ambassador that Biden has not even named. In addition, there are multiple ambassadors that have been named that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has yet to hold a hearing on. And for every one of those nominees on whom there hasn't been a hearing, again, there are no Republican objections. It is simply the Senate Democrats have failed to move forwards with hearings. But there are a number of nominees who've been nominated and who've had hearings on whom I have holds. And we're here today, once again, because the Democrats in this chamber have been unwilling to do the one thing that would stop Vladimir Putin from potentially invading Ukraine, which is sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and making sure that it never becomes fully operational. Now, Senator Shaheen, along with every other senator in this chamber, knows exactly why I have holds on these nominees. Right now, as we speak, over 100,000 Russian troops are massed on the border of Ukraine, waiting to invade. And it is Joe Biden's fault, because it is a direct consequence of President Biden's surrender to Vladimir Putin on Nord Stream 2. For those watching at home asking, what is Nord Stream 2? It's a pipeline being constructed from Russia to Germany to carry natural gas. Putin is building Nord Stream 2 to go around Ukraine because right now, Russian gas gets to Europe through Ukraine. Putin didn't just wake up one day and decide to invade Ukraine. He's wanted to invade Ukraine for years. He did it in 2014, but he stopped short of a full invasion because he needed to use Ukrainian energy infrastructure to transport Russian gas to the European market. Ukraine's energy infrastructure is their insurance policy against a Russian invasion. Nord Stream 2 is all about Putin building an alternative avenue to get Russian gas to Europe. So if Nord Stream 2 comes online, it leaves Ukraine exposed to Russian aggression. Just 2 years ago, we had a bipartisan consensus in the Senate that we needed to stop Nord Stream 2. Now, Senator Shaheen knows that well because she and I authored the legislation together. She and I worked together to get the support of Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and the support of Democrats and Republicans in the House. And the Cruz-Shaheen legislation sanctioning Nord Stream 2 passed both houses of Congress overwhelmingly and was signed into law. And the Cruz-Shaheen legislation worked marvelously well. So well that Putin stopped construction of Nord Stream 2 the day that President Trump signed our legislation into law. Not even a week later, not a month later, the very day that our sanctions were signed into law. It was an incredible bipartisan national security victory that we won together. And that victory continued for over a year. For over a year, Nord Stream 2 lay dormant on the bottom of the ocean, dead, until, unfortunately, Joe Biden became president. Almost from the moment of Election Day, Biden and the incoming administration began projecting weakness to Russia and Putin. And to understand just how much that message was received, Joe Biden was sworn in as president on January 20th, 2021. Putin began building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline again on January 24th, 2021, 4 days after Biden was sworn in. In the Senate, I introduced legislation again on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that passed in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in this Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support to sanction Nord Stream 2 yet again. But this summer, the Biden White House made a political decision to surrender completely to Putin on Nord Stream 2. And President Biden waived the sanctions on Nord Stream 2. He did so overruling the recommendations of his own State Department that argued this protects U.S. national security interests, this stands up to Russia, this protects Ukraine. The Biden White House didn't care about any of that, overruled it all. And then, unfortunately, Senate Democrats lost their willingness to hold Biden to account. This is an issue on which Democrats and Republicans are agreed on the substance. But it can be difficult to stand up to a president of your own party. And on Nord Stream 2, Senate Democrats have not been willing to do so. They were eager to do so when Donald Trump was in the White House. But when a Democrat was in the White House, suddenly their willingness to stand up to the president evaporated. And so the holds that I have placed are directly in order to try to force Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to follow the law and stand up to Russia and stand up to Putin. So I will offer my colleague, Senator Shaheen, a deal that I've offered many times to the White House, to the State Department, to the Treasury Department, to Senate Democrats. A deal that if we, as the Senate, will impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2, CAATSA sanctions, yet another Russia sanctions bill that both Senator Shaheen and I voted for, that we both advocated and supported, and that the Biden administration is refusing to apply. If the Senate will impose those sanctions, I will happily, enthusiastically lift my holds on these nominees, and Senator Shaheen can take her map of Europe and color in all of those countries. We can do that right now by doing the right thing substantively. And by the way, this is the one step which has a real possibility of stopping a Russian invasion of Ukraine. This past weekend, the Biden administration declassified their own internal projections that an invasion is imminent. It could happen as soon as January or February. And if we see Russian tanks in the streets of Kiev, it will be because Joe Biden surrendered to Putin and Senate Democrats weren't willing to hold him to account. I hope that's not the case. We could act right now to sanction Nord Stream 2, to stop the pipeline from being operational, to stop Putin and the soldiers at the border, to prevent the invasion, and to clear these ambassadorial nominees that my Democratic colleagues want. Accordingly, I ask unanimous consent that the Banking Committee be discharged from further consideration of S3322 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is it?
The right to object.
Yes. Is there an objection? Senator from New Hampshire.
Reserving the right to object. My colleague and I agree on our opposition to Nord Stream 2, but I'm not looking at it, despite your accusations, through the same partisan lens that you are, Senator Cruz. And I would go back, I think you threw out a lot of red herrings in your initial objection there, one of which was to suggest that I said that you had a hold on our ambassador to Ukraine, and I actually agree with you. I think this administration needs to appoint that ambassador to Ukraine 8 months ago. And if you agree with me right now, then will you agree that you will not put a hold on the Ukraine nomination once we get it, if we get it within the next couple of weeks, before the end of this year? I'll ask you to think about that for a minute, because I do think we need to have an ambassador there, and that's certainly on my list of places in Europe where we need ambassadors. But I think the bigger question now, you suggest that the mere action of sanctioning Nord Stream 2 would be enough to deter Putin and his ambitions in Ukraine. Sadly, I think that is a simplistic analysis of the situation that we're in, because the biggest deterrent we can provide right now to what Putin is thinking about is to let him know that we are united with our allies in Europe on our opposition to any action he might take in Ukraine, that we are united with our NATO allies, that we are united with our European allies. And unfortunately, one of those major allies is Germany. And I don't think it would be good for the unity message that we need to give to Putin to, at this point, sanction Nord Stream 2, because I think the Germans are going to come to that conclusion on their own. They have a new administration. They have a new administration that has issued some contracts, what they call contracts, in developing their coalition government, that have a very different tone with respect to how they're talking about Russia and China, for that matter. And so I think it's more prudent. I also have real concerns about the current legislation on Nord Stream 2, but I think it's more prudent for us to continue to work with our allies to make clear to Putin what's at stake, and Nord Stream 2 is at stake if he goes into Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. And right now, as we know, the certification of the pipeline has been delayed, and it's been delayed until well after the first of the year. We're not sure what the timetable is, but it's going to be sometime after the spring. And so I just came to a different conclusion than you did, Senator Cruz, about the best way to deter Putin at this point. I think it is to work together. It's not to poke a finger in our most prominent ally on this issue and suggest that we create those divisions, which is what you would like to do. And I think furthermore that the efforts to undermine our appointment of ambassadors and our ability for the State Department to conduct foreign policy further weakens our ability to negotiate with Putin. And it sends a message about divisions within Congress that is really not helpful. It's not helpful as Putin is watching us. It's not helpful as China is watching us. So you and I just have fundamentally different views of how best to address this issue and how we can achieve the goal that we both want, which is to end Nord Stream 2 and reduce Europe's dependence on Russia and to prevent Putin from invading Ukraine. So, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard. Is there objection to the original request?
Mr. President,
The senator from Texas.
reserving the right to object, I would note that Senator Shaheen said it was simplistic to say that sanctioning Nord Stream 2 would stop a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in that, Senator Shaheen may well be right. I cannot guarantee that Nord Stream 2 sanctions would prevent an invasion of Ukraine. What we do know is it has in the past. What we do know is that in 2014, when Putin invaded Ukraine in the Crimea, that he stopped short of a full invasion because he needed the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And we also know that during the more than a year in which the Cruz Shaheen sanctions were in effect and Nord Stream 2 was dead, that Putin didn't mass troops in preparation for an invasion. So we know that it has been effective. And we also know, although I cannot promise that sanctioning Nord Stream 2 would prevent an invasion, we know the obverse is true, which is that allowing Nord Stream 2 to go online and become operational would invite an invasion. Senator Shaheen noted that the certification process is expected to be concluded in January or February of next year. I would note, Mr. President, that according to the Biden administration's own documents, the Russian invasion is expected potentially in January or February of next year. I do not believe it is coincidental that the instant Putin can turn on the switch of Nord Stream 2 is when the tanks are preparing to invade. If the Senate Democrats continue their partisan blockade of sanctions, they are inviting a Russian invasion. Senator Shaheen also said...
Let me ask you a question.
I would happily consent to a colloquy.
I just want to correct what I said, because I think you mischaracterized it. What I said was, we know that the certification has been delayed until after the first of the year, and it's not likely to happen until after the spring, which is well later than January, February. So I just want to correct for the record that, and I think if you look at what's being proposed, you'll find that it's even later than that.
Well, I will accept that correction. I don't believe you said the spring. I think you said after the first of the year, but I don't think...
I went on to say after the spring as well. So
I do not think it is coincidental that the timing of Nord Stream 2 and the timing of an invasion are intertwined. Now, Senator Shaheen also suggested the way to prevent an invasion is to be united with our allies. I actually agree with that. I would point out that this summer, when President Biden waived the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, you know what our allies said? Ukraine and Poland put out a joint statement. I would encourage you to read the joint statement from the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Poland, because they denounced the Biden administration for waiving sanctions on Nord Stream 2. And you know what Ukraine told us? That waiving those sanctions makes a military attack on Ukraine much more likely. That's what Poland told us. Senator Shaheen knows that. She's spoken with the governments of both countries, I am sure. I've spoken with the governments of both countries, and they adamantly believe that waiving those sanctions is a major force increasing the likelihood of a Russian invasion. One of the things that is striking in the debates we've had on Nord Stream 2, throughout the course of all of this, we have yet to see a single Democrat stand up and defend the Biden administration's waiver of sanctions on Nord Stream 2 on the merits. They all know it's wrong. The only arguable benefit that the Biden White House claims is they earned some goodwill with Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel had been the leader of Germany. But as Senator Shaheen noted, she is no longer the leader of Germany. The German people voted her party out of office. And the new administration is expected to oppose Nord Stream 2. So we literally have a situation in which the Biden White House surrendered to Russia, gave a multi-billion-dollar pipeline to finance the Russian military, abandoned our Ukrainian allies, and did it all in search of goodwill from a leader who's no longer in office. You want us to be united? The European Parliament voted to condemn Nord Stream 2. The last vote was roughly 500 to 50 to condemn Nord Stream 2. You want to be united? How about we stand with the 500 and not the 50? If Senate Democrats would not object to my motion, we would be standing with the whole of Europe and we would be united. And a final observation. Senator Shaheen decried the holds as an effort to undermine ambassadors. I would note that I have offered here, as I have offered many, many times, as I have offered in writing as far back as August of this year, to lift the holds if we adopt policy that actually stands up to Russia. Senator Shaheen says her changed position is not partisan. I understand why one would want to say that. But her substantive argument is now she doesn't want us to disagree with Germany. Well, when Senator Shaheen and I authored Cruz Shaheen in 2019, when we authored the second Cruz Shaheen in 2020, when we passed both of them, we were disagreeing with Germany. The German government was very unhappy with it, but it was the right thing for American national security. Nothing has changed, and by the way, when there was a Republican president in the White House, I repeatedly took on the Trump administration and pressed them on this issue. Unfortunately, the only thing that's changed, one thing has changed. The letter behind the name of the person in the White House, now it's a D, not an R, and all the Democrats who gave speeches on Nord Stream 2, suddenly we hear crickets. That needs to change. I object.
Objection is heard.
I just want to clarify a couple of things that Senator Cruz said. One is that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was completed despite those sanctions because what Russia did was to employ their own ships with Gazprom and complete the Nord Stream 2 pipeline despite the sanctions that we had threatened. And it was, in fact, not until right before he left office that President Trump actually invoked some of those sanctions. So, again, I think the response has been somewhat simplistic in terms of what we really need to do now to address what's happening with Russia and Ukraine. And I certainly applaud our allies, Poland and Ukraine, but I think we need to stand united with many more of our allies in Europe in order to deter Putin, that the United States, Poland, and Ukraine probably are not going to do it on our own, and we need all of us to act together. Also, maybe if we had our ambassador to the EU, he could have reported to the Senate what the vote was in the EU about Nord Stream 2. But because he's still on hold, we haven't had a chance to hear from him. I would also point out that at this time in the first year of the Trump administration, 44 of his ambassadors had been confirmed compared to 13 for the Biden administration. And, it seems like there ought to be a number of things we can agree on. And by the way, there was going to be a vote on Nord Stream 2 before some of your colleagues objected to the process under the defense bill. If that hadn't happened, we would have actually had a vote on Nord Stream 2, and we could see what the view of this body is. But unfortunately, it was because of those objections that we didn't get that vote. So I think, again, if you look at our ability to conduct our foreign policy and to be effective against Vladimir Putin, one of the most important things we can do is to put in place our diplomats so that they can help advance American foreign policy. And what's happening right now, in addition to those people you have on hold, we have over 50 State Department nominees on hold because of your objections and the objections of some of your other colleagues. And again, I don't think that's where most of the members of your caucus are. I think most of them, while they may not agree with all these ambassadors, they would agree that we should go forward and allow our foreign policy to move forward with diplomats. So I think I understand your objection to Nord Stream 2. As I said, I've objected to Nord Stream 2. But I think at this point, what we need to do is look at how can we conduct our foreign policy in a way that best puts pressure on Vladimir Putin. And I just disagree with you that that's going to do it right now. So with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Texas.
A brief moment of clarification. Several of the facts that I said in my remarks are undisputed because they're undisputable. Number one, it is a fact that Putin stopped construction of Nord Stream 2 the exact day that President Trump signed the Cruz Shaheen sanctions into law. That day. And the pipeline was dormant for over a year. Now, Senator Shaheen said, well, Putin ultimately went back to building the pipeline, even with the sanctions on the books. That's true. After Joe Biden was sworn into office. Putin began building the pipeline on January 24th, 2021, 4 days after Biden was sworn in. Not a foot of the pipeline was built. Between December of 2019, when the sanctions were signed into law, and January 24th. Putin began building the pipeline because Biden telegraphed his surrender. Secondly, Senator Shaheen suggested that if only we had an ambassador, we might know what the European Parliament did. Thankfully, Mr. President, we have these magic little devices that let us cross the Atlantic in the twinkle of an eye. So we actually know that the European Parliament voted roughly 500 to 50 to condemn Nord Stream 2. So if we want to stand united with Europe, not just Ukraine and Poland, Europe, we want to stand up to Nord Stream 2. And a final point I will say to Senator Shaheen, perhaps as a moment of a word of encouragement, which is I have right now pending an offer with the Democratic leadership to lift a number of these holds, a significant number of these holds, if the Democratic leadership will agree to a vote on Nord Stream 2 sanctions. We're engaged in productive negotiation on that issue, and if the Democrats cease obstruction, we can have that vote, and a number of these holds can be lifted. But that ultimately is going to be a decision for Senate Democrats. I yield the floor.